दिया बजू छाना बिलोरी लगला बिलोरी का खामा झंडिया बजू छाना बिलोरी लगला बिलोरी का खामा नाके की नथुली नाक मिरोली हाथ की कुटली हाथ मिरोली लगला बिलोरी का खामा लगला बिलोरी का खामा झंडिया बजू छाना बिलोरी लगला बिलोरी का खामा.
Wild animals don't believe in long goodbyes. They disappear without a rustle of leaves. A few years ago, we lost the foxes. In the part of the forest that went downhill to a stream, there were particular knots of trees where foxes flitted through the undergrowth as we passed at roughly the same time every day, walking our dog. Some mornings they would stand motionless, their eyes upon us as if tied to a ritual awaiting our arrival. Our dog raced off after them, yet though the foxes took flight in response, they went only a token distance, probably having come to the conclusion that the chase meant nothing. Or there was a shared awareness of their mutual curiosity, an acknowledgement of kinship, the instinct that perhaps they were closer to each other than they could know. At dusk, or deep in the night, the foxes often called, and in response our dog sat up very straight, raised her head to the skies, and joined them, a heart-breaking sound that was not a howl or a whine, but a song of longing, the call of one wild being to another. Their echoing cries travelled across the distance, one creature in the jungle, the other inside a house. Then came the laying of a massive concrete water line that was to snake up from the stream to the highest ridge of our town. The pipes were to traverse great swaths of forest to reach army units stationed in the barracks on the next ridge. Reservoirs were to be built along the way. A labor force of half-starved men in threadbare shirts was offloaded from trucks, and they camped in the woods in shanties that kept them neither fully warm nor altogether dry. Nevertheless, they made a life there and could be heard chatting, cooking, brawling, singing. They washed from water they stored in a metal drum at the forest's edge and cut dead branches from the trees to make pitifully small fires for warmth. And at the end of each day they cooked a big pot of mishmash for their meal. Trucks thundered down with construction goods. Drills went for stone and rock with machine gun bursts of sound. It took 2 years for the work to be finished. Months after the men and trucks had gone and it had rained a few times, blades of grass began to spear their way up from the heaps of rubble and earth that were left behind. When another year or more had passed, the forest began to feel less ravaged, though we noticed that the ethereal banks of autumnal immortelle were gone, and the golden coreopsis that lit up the ground had been driven out by a brash weed that was colonizing every slope. Something fundamental had been altered. Nevertheless, we did expect the foxes to return, cautiously perhaps, testing the ground, taking their time, but we were sure they would be back. Those small, brown, dog-like creatures who had watched us, impassive and bright-eyed. We looked for them every day, going down the old routes we had abandoned in our attempt to stay clear of the pipework. For many months we waited for a glimpse of fox eyes curtained by foliage. Now we have given up hope. Once I met a man on a train that goes daily from Delhi to the Himalayan foothills. I'll call him Mr. Negi. He was from a village near the town of Teri Garhwal, which had a population of about 100,000 until it was washed away from the map by the waters of a giant dam built there to supply electricity to cities in the plains, such as Delhi. As they were watching their town go under, Mr. Negi said, his uncle realized that he had left his typewriter behind in the house, locked away in a battered metal box during the town's evacuation. His uncle was an old man, half blind from peering at that typewriter over a lifetime of work as a lawyer's clerk. Black, bulky, outdated, keys that stuck. Their whole lives were going under. His aunt's eyes red. Yet Mr. Negi's uncle kept crying out, "My typewriter, my typewriter." The last building to drown was the clock tower, Mr. Negi said, an ugly structure he never liked, but at that moment it began to feel urgent and necessary that it stay visible, because as soon as its pointed tip slid from view, it would feel as if a town where every street and building held meaning for them had never existed. Mr. Negi moved to his wife's village, which was on a nearby hill above the old town. The water from the newly formed lake now surrounded it. From being hill people, they had turned into islanders. They had to take boats if they wanted to leave the village, but ferrying trips happened only 3 times a day. It was a steep climb down from his house to the jetty, and it was followed by half an hour on the boat, and you had a long walk ahead on the other side to reach the market or hospital in the new Teri that the government had built to replace the old one. The village had nothing now, he said. No land to grow vegetables, no forest to graze cattle, no streams to fish. Mr. Negi had heard that to capitalize on the novelty of a giant high-altitude lake, the government planned to develop a new kind of tourism around it. Midget submarines would take tourists past the underwater wreck of the old town, the palace, the market, all crumbling away. But the state had no doubt that visitors would flock there and pay good money to enjoy this mini Atlantis so far inland. A thrill very different from the region's standard menu of mountaineering and bird watching. He broke into a bitter laugh. Nowadays everyone says things are ruined because of climate change. Isn't it convenient for governments like ours to have climate change to blame? It is so big, it's international, it's everyone's fault. Yours, mine, China's, America's. And that's worked like a dream, hasn't it? For our ministers, drought, climate change. Floods, climate change. Scorching summers, it's because of climate change. What about the things our governments have done? Doesn't it change the climate to wipe out miles of trees and mountains and replace them with water? The clock tower is undamaged, Mr. Negi said. A hydraulic probe had been sent down to photograph it. The pictures showed it green and mossy, but still upright. People knew this was so years before the probe went in, he said. They had heard the clock's muffled gong down there, from below the water. In the daytime, the sound was too soft to be audible over street noise. But if you sat on the bank of the lake at midnight, with only a softly hooting owl for company, you could hear it ringing 12 times, telling the time for ghosts. It is more than 70 years since the British left India. But the number of those who are grindingly poor runs into the hundreds of millions. They do not accept poverty as preordained in the way their grandparents did. Modern communication technologies have ensured a change. They are perfectly aware that countries have risen from civil wars, natural calamities, epidemics, even nuclear bombs, and that states elsewhere provide most citizens with basic healthcare, food, water, education. The world on mobile phone screens pulsates with color and music and food. In other places, ordinary people seem to have a better quality of life. But for most such millions in India, nothing has changed. Among those over 40, there is a profound sense of resignation that nothing ever will. The young peer at mobile phone screens as if willing the plastic to do something magical. In a country run by politicians who are almost all thugs of different shades, the poor know that governments are of the rich, for the rich, and by the rich. Where the rulers are oblivious to the needs of citizens, wildlife and landscapes exist only to be commercially exploited. An invisible web of plutocrats and corporations controls the ruling regime as well as its rivals. There is resignation, cynicism, and fury as government after government ravages the forests and waters of the country in a tight embrace with giant companies. Nobody can reverse this or stop it. It has been and always will be coitus uninterruptus continuous until there is nothing left to destroy. A few weeks after my conversation with Mr. Negi on the train, I read The Photographer at 16, in which the poet George Surtees reconstructs his mother's life. He is going to write her life from end to beginning, Surtees says at the start of the book. Moving backwards may be like healing a wound, returning to a perfect, unwounded beginning, where all is innocence and potential. He quotes from a poem by Anthony Hecht, in which a diver's action is imagined in reverse. Emerging from a sudden crater of water that closes itself up like a healed wound, to plate glass polish as the diver slides upwards. I wondered how often the man on the train must wish that his town, moving backwards, would surge out from the water, first the tallest treetops, then the ugly clock tower, the roofs of buildings, streets and shops, all intact. A resurrection, as if no time had passed, and no typewriters or tin boxes or foxes and flying squirrels had ever been lost.
गुलाबी मुखड़ी केवली छजीरे नाक की नथुनी केवली छजीरे नाक की नथुनी हाय तेरी रुमाला गवे गलो बंदा हाथ की दकुली गवे गलो बंदा हाथ की दकुली चम चम चमकी रे माथे की बिंदुली अरे चम चम चमकी रे माथे की बिंदुली